You guys hear me all right? Yeah? All right. So I want to talk about API development with Laravel. My name's TJ Miller. I know, I'm not the actor. Yeah, I know, big disappointment, huh? So I've been building APIs with Laravel since version 4. Currently, I'm at International Band Card in Detroit. And what I do there is build solutions to facilitate taking like card acceptance and payments. And the APIs that I build there are super crucial. Because if I make a mistake or if I like ship something or break my API contract, people aren't making money. And that's a really big problem. So what I want to share with you guys today are some of the workflows I've come up with, some of the strategies and implementation patterns that I've kind of developed over the years that kind of make it easy to maintain your API contract and have like an enjoyable development experience. So what are our goals when we're building an API, right? We want a well-documented, a maintainable, well-tested, consistent API. And let's face it, we also want it to be a joy to develop, because that's why we do what we do. So let's kind of start at the beginning of the API development lifecycle, planning. Now, planning is really important for any sort of application you're building, but I think it's a very crucial step, particularly in APIs. And the reason why is because of those high stakes that I was just talking about. When you're building an API, you're giving a contract to potentially an unknown amount of integrators. So think of something like Stripe. You can sign up as a developer, and they don't really necessarily know who you are. And if they ship a breaking change, that's going to affect a lot of people. So we can get everybody in a room during this planning stage and think about all of the business rules and domain logic. And you want stakeholders in the business, you want developers in there, and maybe talk to a couple integrators about how you could build this API to best suit their needs. So what kind of things do we talk about in that planning stage? One of them that comes up is formatting. How are you going to format your request response? There's all sorts of formats out there. We've got JSON API, we've got Siren, we've got JSON. There's so many more out there. But that's a really good time to have that conversation about what you want to do in that planning stage. I don't really think it matters what you choose. I choose a really pretty simple design, works for me, works for people who are integrating with it, but the most important part is you make that decision and you stick with it throughout your entire development lifecycle. So versioning, I think this is kind of a hot topic issue. I don't like versioning APIs. Creates a lot of excess code, creates a lot of opportunities for you to have a problem, and then when you are talking to an integrator, and then you've got this whole new version of the API that they have to basically rewrite their application to integrate with. It's not a really great experience. So API evolution's really where I think it's at. There's no right way to version an API. So some of the tools that we're going to talk about today provide some affordances to kind of mark things as depreciated, like endpoints or data keys. But this is, again, in order to do evolution, it's important to do the planning and revisit planning every time you need to make an iteration and really discuss, do you need to make this breaking change? What are the alternatives? There's probably something you can do other than forking your API and do something different. So the next step, after you do some planning, do the documentation. That's a great way to discuss and document your planning. And by doing this up front, you can kind of enable yourself to do a few other things like parallel development, having your front-end team or potentially another integrator using that documentation and using some of the tools that come along with documenting an API to start their development while you work on the implementation side on your API. And we all know how good we are about circling back to documentation after we're already done. So what do I think is the best tool for this? Open API. There's a lot of options out there for how to document the spec of your API. There's API Blueprint, which primarily gets used through service like Apiary. Open API was formerly Swagger. And up until now, I've been really using API Blueprint and Apiary, but there's a lot of really cool features and a lot of really cool tools that are being used now with the version 3 of OpenAPI. So some of the things you can do with the OpenAPI spec, you can generate mock servers. You can generate beautiful documentation. I think a lot of us here are primarily PHP developers, but who knows, there could be somebody who needs a Java SDK. You can get that through your OpenAPI spec and generate an SDK for just about any language, which is a pretty big freebie. So I could do an entire talk just on OpenAPI and its tooling. So I'm just going to kind of go through an overview of what OpenAPI looks like. So I know this is probably pretty small. We'll step through it a little bit. We'll get there. So this is kind of the first section of OpenAPI. We'll get a little bigger. So this contains a lot of the metadata about our API, including authentication, the title, any sort of generic information you want to put with your API. Like I've got in mind now, I think I've got 15, 20 paragraphs of different documentation that I want to be part of my API and be part of the documentation generation. So all of that stuff kind of goes up here in the header. So the next section we talk about here is where we define the routes. We're going to define the paths, the request, the response, the parameters. So we can dive in a little deeper into what these requests and response and path stuff look like. So this is kind of what it looks like when we define a route. We've got some information about it, some tags, our query parameters. And we also have routes that have dynamic segments. So something like a post API for a blog. We're going to have that post ID. So inside of here, we can also document what that means and pass in a type of like, hey, that needs to be a string or a number, depending on what you want to do. And then let's dive in a little deeper, again, into the responses. So we'll give our different status codes, we'll give a little description, we'll pass in some more details in a schema format for what we expect to be returning, and that's our contract. That's a very important piece. And this is how we would define a post body. So that goes right in there, so that's incoming request data. So JSON schema. This is how we define what those chunks of data look like. So what's coming in is creating a blog post or something that we'll be returning to render in the UI. We're going to use JSON schema to model that data. So open APIs like general documentation or all of your network level stuff, and JSON schema is really the meat and potatoes of your data. So a lot of really cool things you can do with JSON schema, like front-end validation. You can use it in your SDKs to validate things or mark something as depreciated. So if you do need to depreciate a field, you can build it into your SDKs to read that remote JSON schema and maybe log out a warning that we're getting rid of this field or there's something upcoming that's changing. I think there's even a really cool React library that can take JSON schema and just automatically generate forms. So it's really powerful stuff. There are some draft compatibility issues right now between OpenAPI and the latest version of JSON schema, draft 7. So Phil Sturgeon and the team over at WeWork have built a little tool called Specky. And that will not only validate your OpenAPI spec, but it'll kind of do that conversion of taking just about any of the latest versions of I think 4, 6, and 7 of the JSON schema spec and kind of marshalling it into what's compatible with OpenAPI. And then you can go on from there to generate your documentation. And again, this is what it looks like inside of your OpenAPI spec. We've got this a special remote reference field, and we kind of add the path for where that schema is going to be. So how do I break this stuff up in my application? I really kind of follow those resourceful names that we get out of the Laravel framework. So if we've got somebody coming into our team that's a Laravel developer, they can kind of make sense for what these schemas and kind of what they mean and how they correlate. So we've got our post, and that's going to be the main core data, so a title and a user ID and the post body. But then we also have the index and show. So the way that I do my APIs is I've got some nesting in them. I nest all of my data under a data key. And there's not really support for wrapping in JSON Schema, so I kind of use extra files to kind of do that additional wrapping. And then we've got create, and the reason why I break that out is there's different fields and different formats maybe that you need for creating that aren't necessarily the same as what you're returning. So let's start off with what maybe a blog index response would look like. So take a look at this, and we're going to start looking at some valid JSON schema that'll go along with this response here. So again, kind of small. We'll break that up a little bit, remove a few fields just so it kind of fits here for us to talk about a little better. So we've got the properties. This is where we're going to define all the different attributes that are part of that, what makes up a blog post. And inside of there, we've got like the post body. We've got some additional validation of, what types are this going to be? Is this going to be a string? Can we return null here? And then we've got the required attributes. So to be a valid blog post, we're going to always have to send the post ID. But we also notated that it's going to be null. So the key has to be there, but we could maybe return no data. And then we're just saying that this, a blog post is an object. So remember how I talked about how I break this up for data wrapping? This is what it looks like for a blog index. Very similar, but like I said, I nest things under a data key. And then I use some typing to say this is going to be an array of posts, and then kind of referencing back to that post schema. And again, just saying that it's going to be data is going to be an object of arrays. So where do I store this in my Laravel application? Right at the top level. I think it makes sense. It kind of is easy to find. So we've got our API file, and then we've got our schemas directory. So we can talk a little bit about how we split these things up, because we don't necessarily want to host our API documentation on our API server, but I think it's important that we put this kind of documentation along with the source. So we can use a CI job. So when we tag this on GitHub, when it kicks off to CI, we can have a CI process basically pick these files up out of it, generate the documentation, do some conversion with Specky, and then push it to another location. So we can kind of use some other tools to kind of split these things up. So documentation generation, this is a huge thing that comes with OpenAPI. Swagger used to have some OK docs. I don't know if they looked that great, but this is a tool called Redoc. I think it creates some pretty gorgeous documentation. It's easy to find data. It works out pretty good. So now that we've kind of got our planning phase done, we've generated our documentation, I think we're maybe ready to move on to some implementation. This is probably about the same stage that you'd start off some parallel development. You can use a tool like SwagMock to generate a mock server and kind of aid in that development process. So on to implementation. Laravel versus Lumen. I think this is an interesting conversation point. Once we are using a stateless API authentication with Laravel, once we start making queries to a database, Lumen's only about 25% faster than Laravel. So unless you have a unique use case where you really need to eke out as much performance as you can, maybe Lumen's a good choice for a part of your API. I don't know if I would build a whole API just with Lumen. I normally need to access some other features that are native inside of a full Laravel application. And I also think people are a little too soon to break out into microservices. There's a huge cost and a lot of overhead with doing that. So I think maybe it's a better idea to start with Laravel and then kind of break off when you feel measurable pain. And I think the key word is measurable, not perceived pain. You can kind of get yourself into trouble that way. So let's talk a little bit about the setup of taking a new Laravel application and really kind of tuning it for an API. I think we can start at middleware, because there's a whole class of middleware that we just don't need. So we can go in our middleware file, our kernel file, and just remove a whole chunk of them. We can then go ahead and just delete them. There's no reason to have dead code. Oh, I think I got the wrong file type up here. So if we go into our app config, there's also some providers and some aliases that we're just not going to need in our application either. And then we can move on to our route service provider. We can get rid of the web routes. And with Laravel, it also ships out of the box with a prefix of API. So in case you're doing both, you can kind of split things apart. But again, we don't need that. This whole Laravel application is just going to be an API. And then again, some more cleanup. We're not having those routes. Let's just get rid of that routes file. So while we're in the route service provider, I want to talk about a little something that I do to kind of aid in our deployment process and some ecosystem stuff. So I like to add in a status route. And the reason why I put this in the route service provider rather than like in the API route is I might have some globally applied middleware that I want for all of my API routes, but I don't necessarily want it to affect this, and I don't want having this to affect decisions about what I do inside of my API routes. So I put it in the route service provider just so it's kind of like on its own little island, and you can put whatever you want wrapping around this. It's super simple. I just pass back a very basic response of just online true and maybe the application version. I've also sometimes put some non-sensitive configuration data in here just to kind of like as a sanity check for myself. And get like a really easy response just kind of hitting your status route. So the reason why I put this together is for health checks at a load balancer. So if you're using like an ELB, this will kind of enable you to do nice easy health checks, or if you're hosting with Docker inside of a container, you can kind of have that container do health checks on itself to make sure it's up and running correctly. So now that we've kind of got our status route and we've cleaned up a bunch of dead code that we're not going to need, we can dive into that like request response lifecycle. And because we know everything about our API from our planning stages, I think we should dive right into testing first. I think TDD is important, but since we know where we need to end, let's work backwards. So let's create our first test. So if we're going to be kind of talking about a blog, we've got users and posts. So let's start with the users. You can use an artisan command to create this with the feature flag, or you can just go create the file yourself. So this is where we'll start. First test, some easy setup. We'll create a couple users, and we'll make it fail. We'll try to hit that route and just assert that we get 200 back. Let's make this test happen. So we define our route, we give it a name, just give it a 200 response, great. We'll do a little red-green here. So next step, since we know what that response needs to look like and the data that it needs to hold, let's do that. Let's make that test fail. But before we move on to getting building out our controller and putting that response in there, I want to take a second and talk about resource responses. I want to talk about why they're important and kind of show you a little bit about how we use them. So they've been around since Laravel 5.5, and really what they are is a way to abstract and standardize the representation of our models to that response. So this gives us a little buffer in our API contract. So if we need to make internal changes, like a name, like a database name changes, or we need to do something else in the back end, it gives us that abstraction to uphold that contract and be able to have the flexibility to do what we need. And it'll bring consistency across your API as well. A lot of times you'll see that you're doing things in multiple places, and this kind of gives us that opportunity to make sure we're reusing things. So let's start off with a user. And we've got a name, an email, an API token, our timestamps, and our ID. Pretty standard stuff. So how could we maybe make that test pass? Just super easy implementation. We've got a user index. We'll just grab them all and turn them to an array and give it a JSON response. And this is what it looks like. One-to-one representation with our model. So when we look at this, we can think about, API token, it's maybe not something that we want to return all the time when we're grabbing users. And through our planning, we decided that we don't need the API token, we don't need the updated at key. So let's update our controller to reflect that. We kind of specify the data that we want coming out of the database, and then we put it right to that response. So let's do an individual user. as I'm looking at this, this is fine, but I'm already starting to see some duplication. And I'm starting to see some areas where, hopefully our tests will catch it, but if we decide that maybe we need the API key back, or maybe we need the updated app back, I've got to now remember to do it in both places. So let's take it a step further. Let's look at the post. So we're returning some blog posts here, and we decide that we want to include the user. So now in our controller, we've got to format what the post is going to look like, and we're going to have to add that same formatting back into the user. So now we've got 3 places. And I think this is something that's pretty common. So how can we clean this up? There's an artisan command to generate the resource. We generate the resource, and we basically make that same mapping. We map our model into what it's going to look like as like an array representation. Then we can go back and clean up our user controller. I think this looks a lot better. If we need to make any changes, it's automatically reflected. So let's visit the post again. We'll create that post resource. And inside of that post resource, we can reference that resource that we just made for that user. So now, anytime we make that change, it's going to be automatically reflected back here in the post. And there's a lot of really cool features inside of resource responses, like conditions. If I want to maybe have a little bit of flexibility, and I want to make sure I'm not going to create n+1s for myself, because that's something that's really easy to happen here, we're only going to grab this we're only going to grab the author for a blog post when it's eager loaded. So maybe there's a place that I want to return a post and not have a user for whatever reason. I just don't eagerly load it, and that key's not going to be a part of it. But I'm also not going to get caught with an n+1. So let's take a look at that post resource. This is how we would do it in the controller, but let's take a step back and talk about the API token. Maybe for whatever reason we decided we need to include that API token now, so we'll just jump back into our user resource. We'll add it back in there, and then we'll use that same when conditional to, if they've got permission, we'll show the API token. So now we've got a business change, like some sort of domain logic change. In our application, we need to change that database mapping from API token to access token. Just something that was given to us. But we don't want to break our API contract. There's no reason for those other applications for that key to change. It's really just an internal thing. We make that update in one spot, we're good to go. We've upheld our API contract. So what about pagination? Also really easy. We just take our eloquent model, we paginate it, pass it into the resource, and now we've got that formatting already. So this is just using resource responses out of the box. Resource responses also happen to kind of align with the way that I format my APIs, but there's a lot of flexibility into modifying how resource responses format and return their data. So let's revisit our test. We've talked about the importance of resource responses, but kind of let's get back on track on building out this API. So this is where we left off. This test was failing. We created this user resource, and that's what we're going to return out of our controller. Now we've got our user index. Great, our test is passing. But we're also just asserting against a subset of the data. We're just validating that that data was in the response. We're not validating formatting, and we also aren't sure that that's necessarily part of our documentation, and that that documentation, that JSON schema we came up with, we don't really know if this is adhering to that contract yet. So I've been working on a package that can actually assert your Laravel test response against the JSON schema that you're including. There's a couple ways that you can reference that. One of the ways is, there's a config file, you can set up the directory that it all lives in, and then you can just give it the index, just the file name, and it'll automatically put in the path and put in the extension. It's just Laravel JSON schema responses, schema assertions. It's almost 1.0, but I found it very powerful in the APIs that I've been building now to just make sure that I'm upholding my contract with any changes that I'm making in my API. So let's talk a little bit about authentication. So this is something that we would have decided in our planning stage, how we want to authenticate our API and kind of how that data is pulled out of our internal systems. So with Laravel out of the box, we get something called the token guard, which is like a really basic implementation. That's what we're going to use for the rest of our examples. It's kind of like a static token attached to your user. We have Laravel Passport, which was debuted, I think, 2 Laracons ago. And that's a full OAuth implementation for Laravel that drops right in. I've never seen OAuth done so easily. It's really pretty cool. And I think there's a couple JWT packages floating around too, if that's your thing. So this is kind of what we get with the base token guard. Just a bearer token, you can kind of set that to whatever you want. For this use case, we'll go update our migration. 64-bit tokens are pretty good. You can almost guarantee that you're not going to hit duplicates. And to further set this up, rather than having to go create that 64-character string over and over and over again, and then maybe forget to do it in your factories, or part of, you make some change in your controller and you accidentally get rid of it, you can use, like on a user, you can set up in the boot method, like just a listener for the creating event, and automatically tag that on to your user. And that kind of gives you that standardization across the rest of your API. And how we set that up in our Laravel application is, it ships with it. If you use the API middleware, it's automatically using that token driver. But one of the things that I do, since this application is just going to be for an API, the way that Laravel's authentication works is it uses the WebDriver by default. So anytime you're referencing like the auth facade, it's automatically going to be using this web guard. So by changing this token here, kind of cleans things up a little bit. So inside of your tests or inside of any like conditionals where you're checking authentication, you're not going to have to specify, use the API driver. We're building an API. We don't have anything else. And then to further set that up, you go into our routes, and now let's maybe make a protected route for storing a blog post. It's really easy. Just give it the auth middleware. You're all set. So let's take a look at how we now can build in some creation of blog posts. We'll dive through some of the, we'll do our basic setup. We'll do the acting as, and we'll set that user as the currently authenticated user, which will automatically set that bearer token on that request using the token guard. We'll make this fail right off the bat. We'll post some empty JSON, and since we know through all of our planning stages what we're going to have to validate against, I think it's a good place to start our test. So we'll assert that we get the unprocessable entity response code, which is basically failed validation, and then Laravel's got so many good helpers for building APIs that we can just pass in that, we just want to make sure that these two things failed. So let's make it pass. Let's go in, do the validation, and then we can kind of start, working on creating that post. So we'll do another test, and we'll drive that out against the creation. We'll do the same thing. We'll assert that fragment, and then we'll make sure that's in accordance with our contract. So we can make that pass again, and we'll use that resource response. And this is one of the things I like about Laravel is you can make things really clean, really simple, and there's a lot of really verbose testing tools that makes working with APIs really nice. So a lot of features, there's a lot of common features that go across many APIs. And I'm really excited to talk about this package that was recently released that makes doing some of these things like filters or conditional includes or sorting really easy. So Spotsy came out with the Laravel Query Builder. I have written many implementations over the years that do exactly this and never that clean. So this might be a little small. We'll step through it, but I like to start with tests. I think it's a great way to show how things work. So up at the top, we can see kind of what this is going to look like. I want to filter a blog index on, if things are published. So we'll start with our user setup. Then we'll move on to generating this route. So the route helper is fantastic for adding in, additional query parameters really easily. And then we'll just build some assertions against it, again, referencing that it's following our contract. So this is what our post index looked like before. We'll just grab all of the models and we'll pass it through the resource. And to make that change to enable dynamic querying for things, I don't know how it gets any easier than this. So I'm really excited to just mention this package because it's a huge time saver and it really enables a lot of flexibility to your API. And here are some other packages that I install on almost every API that I build, and these are like some of my favorites. So again, lots of them Spotsy packages. I prefer Bouncer for my authorization and my JSON Schema stuff. So further reading on API theory, Phil Sturgeon and I think, agree on a lot of things. This book really changed the way that I look at a lot of APIs. And there's a really cool community that's popped up around this book. There's a really vibrant Slack group. There's a blog that has lots of information about, maybe why should I use GraphQL, or where should I use REST, or how should I approach versioning or API evolution. This is a great resource. So getting ready for this talk, I started getting really passionate about teaching about APIs, and I got really excited to give this presentation to everybody because I think Laravel is great. I think there's a lot of things that Laravel does that makes building APIs fantastic. So I'm going to do something that I respect Adam Wathen a lot for, and Wes Boss, who's going to be coming up next. I'm going to start doing a course on Laravel APIs and kind of really diving into all the specifics that I talked about here. And I'm going to end this on kind of a gushy, feely note. I want to say thank you to everyone who made their way out to this conference and everybody that's part of the Laravel community. This community and this framework has changed my life. So I just wanted to say thank you for everybody coming out and listening to this today.